software engineer at El Passion. I guess enough has been said about the company already, so I won't bother you listening about it again. I'm just having a lot of fun working there and doing stuff that matters, I feel. And today, I wanted to talk to you about my gut feeling that you've been doing CSS wrong. And I also, probably, and I know, I was also doing CSS wrong. So what is wrong with my CSS? This presentation should answer it. Oh, it's so small. This is the simplest button and, that I could imagine. It has a class, though, but yeah, it's one of the simplest I could have imagined. And it looks like this. This is the default browser button that's working and solves a purpose. You can click it, you can hover it, you can, you have a feedback, you have an outline, everything is working correctly. It took 0 lines of CSS to create this button. Nothing. This is the simplest that's working. The default OS X, the default MacBook CSS button. Another one. This one is more complicated. It has a, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but it has a nice hover effect. When I click it, it also is clickable. And when I disable it, it's disabled. Okay? This button took 35 lines of code in SAS. Not that much. The code itself is very simple. We have the box We have the box properties defined here. We defined the height, the padding border, border radius, and outline. Very simple stuff. We defined the background color, also like this. We defined the font characteristics of this button, also some extra properties, an animation, and some states. Everything here is like basic CSS. Like most people understand what's going on here, and if they don't understand, we can meet later. I can explain stuff. But overall, this button gives us cooler look for a cost of 35 lines of code that are self-explanatory, and there are blank spaces in between so that we could divide stuff. But then the designer comes, and he says, make me a red button. So what should we do in this moment? This is the basic stuff. We want to create another button. So what do? We add another 35 lines of SAS. Why did we do it this way? I just copied everything. I didn't bother looking at the code very much. I didn't bother extracting stuff. I was just I just went in and decided, okay, let's create a different button. So I created a new class. I've changed one property, another property, and another property. Those were the 3 only places I've changed the code. So overall, we got 70 lines of code now, and we have 2 different buttons. So it's not bad. 70 is still maintainable. So, many people in backend development will consider 70 lines you can have a class that has 70 lines. It's a very nice class. So why can't I have 2 classes that have 35 lines? Then the third button came, which is blue. Also, it handles all the states. It can be disabled. So what did I do? I've added 35 lines of Sass. Why not? And again, I set the background color, set the background color for hover and active. I know. We can have now 3 buttons. It's amazing. Like, we have 105 lines of code, and like, if I showed my code, like this code, to everyone in the room, they could go through it, even though it's pretty repeated, like most of it is repeated. Everyone could go through it and be sure, without looking at the screen, of how the button will look like. They for sure will know how it's supposed to look like. Okay? For all those 3 buttons, we have a working hover state. We have a hover state here. We can click them. So everything is correctly working. We have 105 lines of code that look pretty bad. But why do we think they look pretty bad? Like, the repetition. Everyone tells us that the repetition is bad. Being a programmer for so many years, when I came into this system of programming, everyone told me that you cannot repeat yourself. Don't repeat yourself. Please try to avoid repeating yourself and try to program. But what's wrong about this code? Besides the fact that I need to copy more in the future to change the behavior, that I need to know how to use find and replace to, I don't know, if the component changes in the future, that I need to work with it. Like, the cost is not that much. I can go through all this code and understand it. But the cost is then on the user. The user gets more kilobytes of lines to his browser. But wait, gzip and stuff like that will remove most of the repetition. We will get not that many lines of code, even though we just bonkers duplicated all of it. So I can say that if someone set a pull request for an application, that I would review then, and the only thing that this application did was have those 3 buttons, I would let this pull request through. I think that it serves its purpose. But then the new designs come in. And now we are getting into a much harder place. We have a button that has a border radius. So it's a bit angled on the corners. But it's still working. So what can we do? Obviously, we can add 35 lines of code for the green rounded button and change the border radius for it. And we have 210 lines of code. It's still simple, still maintainable, and I love it. I'll call it dump CSS. This is a design pattern that makes everyone feel like a programmer. Like, everyone can do everything, know nothing about coding, and they will still write stuff that will look correctly on the web page. This is like pixel perfect. I'm sure that all those buttons are pixel perfect. I'm sure that all those buttons are like reusable. I can reuse them whenever I want. So what is the problem here? If anyone could name me what is the problem here, I would like give him a cake. Maybe one of those. No, there are no more cakes, so I could give him a cake. But the fact is that we thought that we were programming. We were not really programming. I was not really programming writing this code. So like every now backend developer that didn't write any CSS in his past, or he hates writing CSS, is so happy. I'm like, yeah, this guy is very stupid. He's writing stupid CSS. No one likes CSS. CSS is not programming. So And he was true. Here, I was not programming at all. I was just adding lines of code. So if we could define programming, this book, this is the Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs. This is the first book everyone at MIT who's studying computer science gets a hand on and needs to write through all of it and pass this is like the basics. I highly suggest this book for everyone. And at the first chapter, it tries to define what is programming. And it defines it by combining several ideas into one compound one. Programming is nothing more, nothing less than just taking two ideas or more and combining it into one. So if you think that when you're writing machine code 010101, you're programming, you're not programming. If you're just writing out the stuff that the computer needs to know to render something. And if we go a level higher, if you think that if you wrote assembly code directly that didn't have any abstractions, you will still not be programming. It will just run the code you've written. So programming is just combining several simple ideas into one compound one. And how does this affect our code? How to program in CSS? Everyone will say, OK, my language, I have a programming language. I can build abstractions. I can go and create variables, even though in the new CSS you could also create variables, but it's not a point of this talk. You could also add new extract stuff, and you could define constants, classes, everything. The programming languages out there are so powerful, and CSS is just dumb. Or is it? Let's start building abstractions. OK? Those are the two buttons I was talking about. Obviously, when we take the definition of programming very literally, if we want to combine two simple things together, like a rounded button and a button with smaller edges, we would prefer to just write border radius 8 pixels and 20 pixels after it. This is combining stuff together. Or is it? The first method of abstracting common behavior in CSS we get to learn is that one element can have multiple classes. So here, the simplest way to build an abstraction between those two buttons is create a new class that will contain the properties that need to be shared. Border radius 8 pixels. I'll create a class called radius big that will have a definition of 20 pixels. And then I will have to use the button class button and also radius big to render it. And I will have radius small for the other one. And then I dropped back to 110 lines of code. And everything can be shown on one page again. So I can now call myself a programmer. Okay? CSS is programming. I've just created an abstraction. I've just dropped the amount of code that has been written. So I'll do the same thing with the background. Okay? I'll take the background properties, the color, from the hover and active, I'll take the properties, and I'll create a new class called green. And I'll set the background color there. I'll also set the hover and active. Those were the things that were changing, but I didn't, at start, extract them to their smallest part. I do the same thing for red, and I do the same thing for blue. And now we have 80 lines of code. Okay? Another huge success, I've got 20 lines, 30 lines of code less. Everything is working perfectly. We created 2 abstractions. I can go to sleep. Like, I did my job. Everything is working correctly. Or is it? Oh, perfect. My sound isn't. Oh. I get a call while I'm sleeping. It's the customer. They're really mad because I just broke the application. I've just introduced a bug. And every single one of you who looked at my code and building of my abstraction, probably maybe someone noticed, but we've just introduced a bug. By implementing the simplest abstractions there, we've managed to introduce a bug. How does the bug look like? Obviously, when we disable the button and we hover over it, it changes the color. Why does it do so, right? I have 100 people here sitting, and we all looked at the simplest refactoring possible of just extracting few colors to another class, and we already have a bug. This is a very dangerous territory we're working on. And I didn't notice it. The funny thing is that during making of this presentation, my whole flow changed because I've introduced this bug. I decided that I need to cover this part. And what was the bug? Obviously, the disabled definition is here in the global button class. And it has a lower specificity over the hover and active. Obviously, the fix is to define those as hover-enabled and active-enabled so that it doesn't cover the same elements that the previous disabled rule covered. After doing so, our button is working like this and working like this. So what did we learn during this process? We learned that building abstractions is hard, even the simplest ones, and nothing is for free, okay? Building an abstraction can lower the lines of code, just like on the right. The more the abstraction we have, probably the lower the amount of lines of code we have. And the higher the abstraction we have, the higher the complexity. This is the cost of creating abstractions, even the simplest ones. And how do we get some sleep? Okay? I don't want to be afraid of working with CSS all the time. This is a very hard task because no one is covering this. Even at the start of presentation, I wasn't even programming. So how can I cover it with tools available there? Obviously, I can remember possible mistakes and not make them again. I can click through the app and after changes more carefully, which I should have done even through this presentation. And I should not deploy right before sleep, right? So are there any other suggestions? I think we should treat our CSS just like we would with any other programming language. And how do we do it with all of the programming languages? Obviously. Our process previously was to write the simplest green button, then duplicate the button for different colors. Everything was working. Duplicate button for different radiuses. Everything was working. Extracting border to different classes, so introduce an abstraction, and then extract color to different class, broke it. We, of course, later applied the fix. So the solution is we can write automated tests for the button. We can, this is pseudocode. Don't read through it too much. We can check that the disabled button on hover has correct color. We can find the button, we can hover over it, and check the color. And obviously, we should do the same exact thing for not only this button, but also for other buttons, like for the red one, for the green one, for the blue one. Then we can introduce another abstraction of having one button that's changing depending on the property we gave to him, but this would require another framework. So how should we be sure of not breaking anything without explicitly stating so many tests? Obviously, writing tests is cool. I write in TDD most of my days. But in CSS, the part is a bit different because there will be a lot of those tests, and they will be changing constantly. Even when you're working with your designers very closely, even when you know they're making good designs, the designs will change constantly. And for styles, writing tests is a bit tougher than for normal classes. You don't have a strict input-output. Even the side effects are sometimes harder to explain. And you will still need to manually look at the button to know if it's all right or not. You cannot just write in your code like in a TDD way that the button looks like this, and so it's OK. We can obviously check for all of its styles, but we still need to use the eye to check it anyway. There will be bugs introduced that still, even though we're covering them with unit tests, will not be found until deployed to production. So we can try to understand the platform and not fight it. Okay? Like CSS has a lot of mechanisms of introducing new properties to an element. It's not the only way that we can add another class to an element, that we can style it. We don't have to fight with the specificity. We can embrace the platform. And how can we embrace the platform when it comes to a simple button and working with it? And there is one quick solution for working with CSS like this. And I will try to, as always, because my stuff isn't working properly, I'll move my Visual Studio here. And I also have my Chrome here with my React application. I have my green button, and I want to do the exact same thing I did on the presentation. So I want to build another button, this time only one. I'll call it, I'll increase the font just for you to see it first. I'll increase the font. I call this one the red button. I'm using styled components here, but it's just for like I like using it. And I'll try to at start copy all of it directly. Like not even bother using any of the library, and copy it directly here. Then import it here. And use it here. Whoops. I think red button cannot create style. Like this? Nope, not here. I did something wrong. Button. Like this? Okay, perfect. I'll just change the color here first. I'll put it to red or crimson so it doesn't look boring at start. I'll change the. Oh shit! God. Can I have a minute more? Like a minute more?
59 seconds.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay. I'll go with red here. I'll go back with crimson here. Do it. Check it. Okay, it's working. I'll add the disabled to it, just for you to understand what I want to show. I'll add the disabled. Okay, it's disabled. Perfectly working. I did no programming yet. So we will start with programming. I'll drop the border extracting because I don't have time. But I'll export. I'll try to create. I'll try to create one button.
20 seconds.
Whoa. I had a problem with setup. Give me a second. Because I'll drop a controversial thing at the end. I'll extract the common logic, just as I did previously, to the button. I'll just drop the color. I'll move this part. Okay, now I'll call this one the green button. No, like 15 seconds more.
Thank you.
Green button, okay, it's, okay, perfect.
9.
No.
8.
Oh. I had some technical difficulties at the start.
Mm-hmm.
Give me a break.
Story of our lives, yes? Everybody?
Okay, no, I broke it. Never mind.
Oh, no.
Anyway, I'll just...
Give him a big hand.
I'll just say...
Yeah, you can do that. You can actually do that while they're asking questions.
Okay.
So while you guys are asking your questions, maybe he can fix this situation over here.
No. I will... Oh, I know.
Yes.
I know what's going on.
Does anyone have any questions for Michał?
Not before I drop my important part. I'll style the button. Okay, perfect. So how do we assure that the disabled is still working? And I will drop just one line that will make you even more angry than you were before, as how I would have probably made it the simplest way. I would have made this important. No.
You now have only 1 minute left for questions, Michał,
But
and these
it's
people
working.
have pressing questions. Oh, good.
But
Congratulations.
it's working. Okay. And if you disagree with me, I'm waiting for a reason as to why I should have not used it. Thank you very much.
So my question is, why haven't you used SAS mixins?
SAS mixins, exactly. Same problem. Same problem, exactly, of creating another abstraction ahead of CSS. It increases the entry point for new developers. It makes you dependent on another tool. It compiles slowly. I hate SAS because it has to compile. So we're dropping essentially what the platform gives us. Important is not an escape hatch. Important is a way to write the code. Of course, it's our code, so we can write it that way. I didn't use mixins, and I didn't use SAS. And for the same reason, I didn't use style components like hierarchy here, because I felt it wasn't needed, and I could have escaped the bug anyway without using it.
Okay. By the way, your American accent is better than mine. Anyone else have any questions for Michał?
You said that mixin is another abstraction, but don't you think that adding CSS-in-JS, so this JS has to be compiled to CSS, and you use a third-party library, and you don't know what this library exactly does. And I think that mixin is a A lot smaller abstraction.
Okay. I feel like I can argue for hours of why styled components is better, but let's not talk about that part. Obviously, you're right. This was only for the purpose of the demo. I could have done it without style components, so just using exactly only CSS and overriding the class. I just did it because I had not enough time to finish it yet without React, so I wrote it in React just as I usually do. The important part here is, don't worry, in our company, we don't use important that much. And it was for the purpose of a presentation to show that, abstraction, even the simplest ones, can introduce bugs. And sometimes it's better to not keep it dry. And sometimes it's better to use the platform tools that we have and embrace them.
Thank you, everybody. Michał, fantastic presentation.